Have you ever looked at a map and seen borders that look like someone spilled a drink and then traced the stains? Have you ever wondered how a single valley could be divided between three countries in a way that creates weird peninsulas, isolated exclaves, and knots of territory so tangled that they seem to defy logic? And here is the question that gets to the heart of it. What happens when internal boundaries, drawn up by a long-vanished empire as purely administrative lines, suddenly become international borders, trapping communities, creating flashpoints, and forcing three newly independent nations to figure out how to coexist? We are going to take a deep dive into one of the most visually complicated border regions on Earth. We are going to talk about the Fergana Valley in Central Asia, a lush, densely populated oasis divided between Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. We are going to explore how these borders came to be, why they look the way they do, and how three countries have managed, despite decades of tension and occasional violence, to finally start resolving their differences. Let us start with the geography, because you cannot understand the borders without understanding the land itself. The Fergana Valley is a large green oasis, about the size of New Jersey, located smack dab in the center of otherwise dry, arid grasslands and steppes. It is encompassed by mountain ranges on all sides except the west, and it is lush and ideal for agriculture because it is fed by two rivers that originate from glacial runoff and snowmelt higher up in the mountains, the Syr Darya and the Kara Darya. These rivers have sustained human civilization here for thousands of years, making the valley a prize worth fighting for. At the crossroads of multiple civilizations and located directly along the historical Silk Road trade route, the valley has been considered prime real estate for millennia, a place where caravans stopped, where cultures mixed, and where empires clashed. Today, the Fergana Valley is home to about 17 million people, by far the most densely populated part of Central Asia, encompassing about 1 in 5 of the region's population. To put that in perspective, that is more people than live in the entire country of Chile, all packed into an area the size of New Jersey. And the borders across it are the most janky you'll find anywhere in the world. They are not just messy, they are a cartographer's nightmare, a geopolitical puzzle that has defied easy solutions for decades. The valley is divided between three countries: Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. They zigzag, twist, and intermingle together in what is certainly the worst example of border gore on the planet. There are super weird artificial peninsulas of territory that barely even connect to the rest of their home countries, like this peninsula of Uzbekistan around the town of Sok that plunges into Kyrgyzstan, connected only by an ultra-narrow 360-meter-wide chicken's neck. Imagine a piece of land so tenuously connected that you could walk across the connection in a few minutes, yet it belongs to a different country than everything around it. There are even weirder borders of Uzbekistan in the far east of the country that are theoretically contiguous around a body of water, but, in practice, are actually a series of tiny Uzbek exclaves on the wrong side of the water, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan. Large arms or branches of all three countries twist and knot together in the center of the valley, creating a geographical puzzle that seems to have no logical solution. And then, to make things even stranger, there are no fewer than 8 exclaves of territory completely isolated from their mainlands and geographically surrounded by other countries. These are pieces of one country that are entirely enclosed within another, like islands of sovereignty in a sea of foreign territory. 6 of these exclaves are located within Kyrgyzstan, in its southwestern arm, the Batken region, one of the most visually complicated border regions on the planet. 2 belong to Tajikistan, 4 belong to Uzbekistan. Some are so small they are nearly irrelevant, like a Tajik exclave surrounded by Kyrgyzstan that consists mostly of a road, a creek, and a single farm. These tiny exclaves are reminders of how arbitrary and contingent borders can be, How the decisions of bureaucrats decades ago can create pockets of territory that make no geographic sense. Others are major and hotly contentious population centers, home to tens of thousands of people. The most contentious is Voruk, a larger exclave of Tajikistan, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan, densely populated and home to around 45,000 people. With no access to the mainland of Tajikistan, these 45,000 residents have been marginalized, isolated, and impoverished, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan for decades. Imagine living your entire life in a place where you need a passport to visit the rest of your own country, where a trip to see relatives involves crossing an international border. Tajikistan has historically rejected the idea that it should even be an exclave in the first place, claiming a narrow land corridor from the mainland across the internationally recognized territory of Kyrgyzstan, which Kyrgyzstan has fiercely rejected, leading to multiple modern conflicts that have cost lives and destroyed property. Uzbekistan also has 4 of its own exclaves in the Batken region. 2 are relatively small and located near the Uzbek mainland. The other 2 are very large and much stranger. Shohimardan is farther into Kyrgyzstan and home to around 5,000 people. The Sok district is the strangest border example in the whole region. It is a large exclave of Uzbekistan, bordered by Kyrgyzstan, and home to around 80,000 people. Yet nearly all of those 80,000 people are ethnic Tajiks, neither Uzbek nor Kyrgyz. So you have a piece of Uzbekistan, inhabited by Tajiks, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan. It is hard to imagine a more complicated ethnic and political tangle. Complicating matters further, there is one more exclave of Kyrgyzstan, the village of Barak, which is surrounded by Uzbekistan. And there is another long, narrow exclave of Tajikistan, with a small village inside, also surrounded by Uzbekistan. So every possible combination exists. Uzbek territory in Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz territory in Uzbekistan, Tajik territory in Kyrgyzstan, Tajik territory in Uzbekistan. It is a complete jumble. On top of all this, there is a very high degree of overlap between ethnic and political borders. Large numbers of Tajiks live on the other side of the political border in Uzbekistan. Large numbers of Uzbeks live across the political borders in both Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. This means that even where the borders are clear, the populations are mixed. People feel loyalty to their ethnic group, even when it is across the border from their country. It is a recipe for tension, and it has played out that way repeatedly. These confusing borders were originally drawn by the Soviet Union when the whole region was under its control across most of the 20th century. To understand why, we need to go back to the history before the Soviets arrived, because the roots of this mess go deep. By the early 19th century, the Fergana Valley was broadly unified under the control of the Kokand Khanate and was home to an extremely diverse population. There were Persian and Turkic-speaking sedentary communities who practiced agriculture, highly intermingled, collectively referred to as Sarts. And there were nomadic Turk-Mongol tribes around the valley's edges and mountains, who often invaded and settled among the Sarts. Throughout this time, there was really no modern concept of ethnicity or nationalism in the valley. There was no clear way to make scientific distinctions between people. People were very often multilingual and had numerous intermingled ancestries. Most people's identities were based more on the sedentary nomadic divide, their tribe or clan, or their religion, which in most cases was Islam. In other words, identity was fluid and contextual, not fixed and exclusive. Then, gradually, between the 1850s and 1870s, it was invaded, conquered, and annexed to the Tsarist Russian Empire. After conquering Central Asia, the Tsarist authorities divided the area into just 2 large administrative regions, governed as colonies. They allowed a high degree of autonomy, generally leaving people to manage their own affairs, until the First World War. The Russian Empire was more interested in extraction than in transformation, so it left local structures largely intact, as long as they paid tribute and stayed peaceful. In 1916, facing workforce shortages on the front lines of World War I, the Tsarist regime expanded military conscription to the empire's Muslim inhabitants for the first time. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. It triggered a massive revolt amongst Muslims in Central Asia, beginning in the Fergana Valley, known as the Basmachi movement. The revolt quickly adopted a pan-Turkic, Islamist, and secessionist character. Local elites in the Fergana Valley identified with Turkic identity, inspired by the Turkish nationalism thriving in the dying Ottoman Empire. It was the first real stirring of modern nationalism in the region. After the October Revolution in 1917 and the Bolshevik seizure of power, they inherited this raging revolt. The Bolsheviks were not interested in autonomy or negotiation. After the Red Army took over the city of Kokand in early 1918, they perpetrated a massacre, killing as many as 25,000 inhabitants. This atrocity only rallied support for the Basmachi revolt even further. A brutal, years-long guerrilla and conventional war ensued, resulting in the confirmed deaths of more than 9,000 Red Army soldiers and probably tens of thousands of local inhabitants. After more than 6 years, the Bolsheviks largely suppressed the revolt by 1923, but the memory of that violence shaped Soviet policy for decades. Meanwhile, in 1922, they proclaimed the establishment of the Soviet Union. Initially, the previously autonomous Khanate of Khiva and the Emirate of Bukhara saw their regimes overthrown by local forces aligned with the Bolsheviks and voluntarily entered the Soviet Union as People's Soviet Republics. The former governorates were incorporated into the new Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic as autonomous regions. The Soviet system was taking shape, but the borders were still provisional. Almost immediately, the Soviets wanted to redraw these internal administrative borders, viewing them as a nonsensical hodgepodge. They wanted to use what they considered a more rational, scientific approach, based on ethnographic and demographic data. The Marxist-Leninist ideology held that the former empire should be rebuilt as a brotherly union of nations, working towards a stateless communist society. The general idea was to divide the country into a series of Soviet socialist republics, each based largely around one of the largest ethnic groups, designed to be as ethnically homogeneous as possible. This was supposed to be a progressive move, giving each nationality its own homeland within the larger union. In 1924, shortly after the Basmachi revolt was largely pacified, the Soviets began drawing borders for these new SSRs. At the time, Joseph Stalin was the People's Commissar of Nationalities, so the new borders were largely drawn under his guidance. This has led to a century of mixed opinions about Stalin's intentions. Critics accuse him of pursuing a policy of divide and rule, deliberately drawing convoluted borders to ensure maximum chaos and competition, keeping the republics over-dependent on Moscow for arbitration. While Stalin may have had these intentions, drawing clear ethnic borders across the complex identity matrix of the Fergana Valley was virtually impossible for anyone, even with the best of intentions. To establish a clearer picture, the Soviets ordered a census. But this was far easier said than done with 1920s technology. Census takers conducted surveys painstakingly on horseback and door-to-door, especially difficult for nomadic communities with no fixed addresses. The concept of ethnicity was still foreign to many locals. Huge numbers spoke multiple languages, had mixed ancestries, and lived intermingled. It was so convoluted that frustrated ethnographers would demand residents choose one nationality, only for people within the same immediate family to choose completely different ones. Ethnic identity was highly fluid and didn't always fit neatly into the major nationalities the Soviets identified. Persian-speaking sedentary peoples grouped as Tajiks, Turkic-speaking sedentary peoples grouped as Uzbeks, and nomadic Turco-Mongol peoples grouped as Kyrgyz, despite most people's identities overlapping in various combinations. All this made drawing accurate borders, neatly dividing nationalities into clean geographic areas, effectively impossible. It is a major reason the borders look so janky today. The Soviets were also incentivized to encourage local national identities like Tajik, Uzbek, and Kyrgyz, to suppress and divide the unifying ideologies of pan-Turkism and Islamism that had spawned the dangerous Basmachi revolt. By encouraging new ideas of regional nationalism dividing the valley, they hoped to prevent another unified revolt. This was a deliberate strategy: create smaller identities that would compete with each other, rather than unite against Moscow. Communist authority was not yet firmly established, so they needed local cooperation, opening the process to corruption and bribes from officials seeking to incorporate their ancestral villages into their new republics, even if the local ethnic identity didn't match. Local elites saw an opportunity to gain influence and took it. While the Soviets wanted the SSRs to be as ethnically homogeneous as possible, they also wanted them to be economically viable, meaning a population of at least 1 million, a fair allocation of water resources, and a capital city connected by rail. In many cases, economic considerations were placed ahead of demographic ones, creating borders that made economic sense but ethnic nonsense. Ultimately, by the end of 1924, the new SSRs were formed. Initially, the Uzbek SSR included its own ASSR for Tajiks, but in 1929, the Tajik ASSR was split off into its own SSR. At about the same time, the Kyrgyz Autonomous Oblast was created, and in 1936, it too became its own SSR, along with Kazakhstan. Central Asia was now divided into 5 new SSRs, with the Fergana Valley split between 3 of them. The process took more than a decade and involved numerous adjustments. There were many controversies. Tajik speakers primarily inhabited the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand, but surrounded by Turkic-speaking countryside, they were placed in Uzbekistan, still inflaming passions in Tajikistan to this day. Uzbeks and Europeans primarily inhabited the cities of Osh and Jalalabad in Kyrgyzstan. Still, the Soviets were concerned that giving them to Uzbekistan would deprive Kyrgyzstan of economic hinterlands and significant cities, so they gave them to Kyrgyzstan, a decision contributing to large-scale inter-ethnic violence decades later in 2010. Every decision created winners and losers, and the losers remembered. For over 60 years, the Soviets pursued nation-building within each SSR, promoting distinct ethnic and national identities. The convoluted border drawing continued for decades after Stalin's death. The largest and most infamous exclave, the Sok district of Uzbekistan, surrounded by Kyrgyzstan and inhabited almost entirely by Tajiks, wasn't created until 1955. The reasoning remains unclear. There are legends that it was lost by a Kyrgyz official during a card game, or that it was given to Uzbekistan because the main roads connected with Uzbekistan, rather than the rugged Kyrgyz territory. Many revisions were made as late as the 1980s, tweaking borders based on local conditions and politics. None of this convoluted, intermingled nature mattered much to the Soviets because it was all part of the same country. These were internal boundaries on paper, not hard international borders. People could freely travel back and forth across them at will. A Tajik from Varuk could visit relatives in the Tajik mainland without thinking about it. An Uzbek from Sok could shop in Kyrgyz villages without a passport. The borders were administrative conveniences, not barriers. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. All the SSRs unexpectedly became independent sovereign nations, and the convoluted internal borders suddenly became international borders. For the first time in centuries, the Fergana Valley was politically divided, without a strong centralized authority, now home to 3 brand new competing states. The transition was abrupt and chaotic. All 3 initially cited different Soviet maps from different decades to claim their borders. Large segments of the mutual border areas remained unclear and non-delineated for decades, especially around the exclaves. Large numbers of Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Kyrgyz ended up on the wrong sides of borders or trapped in enclaves. People who had lived their whole lives in one place suddenly found themselves in a different country, cut off from relatives and traditional trading partners. Initially, relations were calm enough, with countries generally allowing access to exclaves via roads across each other's territories. There was a kind of informal understanding that the borders were still porous. But things shifted rapidly in 1999. In February, a militant group, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, attempted to assassinate the Uzbek president. The IMU took advantage of the complex borders, basing itself in the Sok enclave. Over the summer, they invaded the surrounding Botkan region of Kyrgyzstan, seizing the Kyrgyz village of Barak and taking hostages. This was a wake-up call for all three governments. Uzbekistan deployed soldiers to surround the village and lay siege, which is how Barak became a Kyrgyz exclave surrounded by Uzbekistan. During and after this conflict, Uzbekistan began unilaterally demarcating and sealing its borders with Kyrgyzstan, building barbed wire fences, checkpoints, and even minefields, in some cases advancing beyond the recognized border. They expanded these around Barak even after militants were cleared, leaving it as a truly entrapped exclave, isolated by hard borders. They added minefields around their own exclaves, outraging Kyrgyzstan. The 1999 Botkan conflict resulted in nearly 1,200 deaths, mostly military combat, and set a new tone of suspicion and hostility. Uzbekistan then unilaterally demarcated its border with Tajikistan, using similar methods. This hostile approach continued until the death of Uzbekistan's longtime authoritarian president, Islam Karimov, in 2016, opening a path to restored relations. Karimov had ruled with an iron fist for decades, and his death created an opportunity for change. Uzbekistan agreed to delineate its border with Tajikistan in 2018 and with Kyrgyzstan in 2022, steadily removing barbed wire and minefields. The agreement with Kyrgyzstan notably included a land swap, eliminating the Kyrgyz exclave of Barak. By 2024, Barak was fully absorbed into Uzbekistan, and its residents were resettled. This was a major breakthrough, showing that a peaceful resolution was possible. Despite this, the Kyrgyzstan-Tajikistan border remained largely undefined, with violent incidents continuing. In 2010, inter-ethnic violence between Kyrgyz and Uzbek communities in Osh and Jalalabad resulted in hundreds to potentially thousands of deaths and thousands of destroyed homes, a legacy of the Soviet decision to place those cities in Kyrgyzstan. The violence shocked the world and displaced tens of thousands, a stark reminder of how quickly ethnic tensions can explode. Hundreds of kilometers of border remain disputed, especially between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan around the exclaves. While the 2010 violence captured headlines, smaller, localized skirmishes continued for years. Then, things escalated dramatically in 2021. A dispute over a shared water pumping station near the Voruk exclave exploded into multiple armed confrontations across the border, with both sides using heavy artillery, drones, mortars, and attack helicopters. This was not a border skirmish, it was a war. Particularly heavy fighting occurred north of Voruk, where over 40,000 people remained trapped. Tajikistan claimed a land corridor to connect to Voruk, which Kyrgyzstan disputed. 55 people were killed in this 4-day war, and hundreds were injured. Borders were completely sealed, and Voruk's residents were unable to leave for years, trapped in their own homeland. Sporadic clashes continued until they erupted into even deadlier, full-scale fighting in September 2022. For 6 days they fought again, with nearly 150 soldiers killed, and over 100,000 civilians on the Kyrgyz side temporarily displaced. Villages were shelled, homes destroyed, families separated. It was the worst violence between the two countries since their independence. After years of contentious negotiations, with mediation from Russia and other regional powers, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan announced in early 2025 that relations would be fully restored. Borders would reopen for the first time in 4 years. Most spectacularly, they agreed to resolve all outstanding border disputes and fully delineate their borders, including land swaps, and a neutral corridor enabling Tajik access to Varuk without Kyrgyz surrendering territory. It was a diplomatic breakthrough that few had thought possible. A few weeks later, Uzbekistan joined them, jointly declaring that for the first time since the Soviet collapse, they had agreed to fully resolve all outstanding border disputes and fully delineate all shared borders, dramatically reducing the odds of further interstate violence. The three presidents stood together, signing documents that would finally put an end to decades of conflict. While the borders still look really weird and janky across the Fergana Valley, and while they've sparked violence and controversy, they've also been remarkably more stable than nearly anyone expected back in the 1990s. Central Asia has witnessed significantly less violence overall than other post-Soviet regions like the Caucasus and Ukraine, or post-Yugoslav regions like Bosnia and Kosovo. It deserves far more credit than many have given, and should serve as a role model for conflict resolution. Messy, weird-looking borders don't have to lead to enormous violence and attempts to redraw them. Central Asia is the biggest proof of that. If you found value in this deep dive, if it helped you understand the complexity of the region, or gave you language for things you've been trying to grasp, make sure you like this video, subscribe to Infographics, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because understanding the forces that shape our world, even the most complicated ones, is the first step toward being able to navigate them. The borders of the Fergana Valley are a reminder that history, ethnicity, and politics can create messes that last for generations, but also that with time and goodwill, even the messiest situations can be resolved. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.